Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Please take a seat. Please be quiet as well. We're really happy to welcome John Bew tonight, who first had an academic career that any student would only dream about here tonight. First of all, a well-noticed PhD at Cambridge University, then an academic career that led him to be a lecturer and a research director, and since 2013 he's been a professor of history and foreign policy at the War Studies Department at King's College, London. And this academic background was also marked by the fact that he was the youngest person to hold the Henry Kissinger Chair in 2013-14. He received several awards and grants, and that led him to be an authority on his topics of interest, and you'll have his full bibliography on the Chair's website. 3 key works that all received awards and were celebrated in the British and international press. First, work on Robert Stuart Castlereagh, especially published in 2011, probably better known in France, the bibliography published in 2016, a biography on Attlee, and also a seminal work in 2015 on realpolitik. He started with research on the issue of Northern Ireland and the birth of unionism, and then in-depth work on the notion of realpolitik. I think that by listening to him, you'll probably forge your own opinion, and you'll probably have questions to take a deeper look at the current state of this doctrine in international relations today. But on top of that, like many of our speakers, he's now involved more directly as advisor to the Prime Minister in Downing Street, has been since 2019 under Boris Johnson, then Liz Truss, then Rishi Sunak. And if you see his career, I can recognize some of my own professional steps in this cabinet, where he's in charge of international relations. He led exercises that we knew were similar to the white paper, the Livre Blanc in France, but something that was very studied in France, the Integrated Review on Matters of National Defense and Security under Johnson, and more recently updated under Sunak. So we're really delighted to welcome him here today. And it's true that the theme might seem very broad, because it's both about the past, the present, and the future of British strategy in a changing world. And I'm sure that he himself will also refocus on the most contemporary aspects. And anyway, your questions, we are much less cultured than him about British history, and we are welcoming you here as a master, but maybe we'll refocus some of the discussion on the contemporary period. So, John, we're really happy and honored that you've taken some of your time to come all the way here at a time when all chancelleries are kept busy by many questions, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and also, of course, when I can imagine that the Prime Minister's cabinet on international matters is also very mobilized. So thank you for taking some of your time to come here. And you have the floor, the rules. You have as much as you want, especially given the breadth of your topic for your lecture. So then maybe we'll have a discussion together. I'll remind you that then we'll move to questions from students, and then questions. Welcome to all our participants to this 2024 chair cycle, people from the outside, experts, students at EHIDR, military personnel, journalists. You have the floor, John.
Merci, Louis.
Good evening, Louis. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to be here at Sorbonne University tonight.
Forgive me, I will speak in English this evening, and please forgive me even more because I will speak in English with an Irish accent. So I hope not to speak too quickly, but I am born and bred in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and much as I've spent half of my life in England, it's still, the residue is still there, and there's certain words you may pick up on that sound strange for the translator. As you heard from Louis, I am very much an academic, first and foremost, a trained historian who, perhaps to a certain extent against my wishes, found myself in government service 5 years ago, and it's a real pleasure to speak at such a distinguished academic setting. And I want to speak as a historian and as an academic who's been involved in policymaking rather than primarily a policymaker. And today I want to do something which is offer you a grand sweep of British grand strategy and national security. I will try and cover as many centuries as possible in the space of certainly under an hour, and preferably something more like 45 minutes. So forgive the brevity and the simplicity with which I will deal with some periods of history. Some periods of history, of course, that involve happy Anglo-French relations, and some periods of history that involve less happy Anglo-French relations. And I want to take that story right up to the modern period, and I imagine with journalists and people very much consumed about current national security, we can bring the discussion to a more present-minded state. But I'm going to start with history, and I'm going to lean in hard on history, because I think history, and this is the main argument of my lecture today, history, historic knowledge, historic sensibility, the type of reasoning that comes through knowing and understanding history is absolutely vital to help us navigate what is a very difficult national security, international policy environment. I think history must come first. So today's lecture comes in 3 parts. In the first, I will talk about, with great brevity and pace and brio, I hope, the foundations of British grand strategy. Then I'm going to talk about some of the key foreign policy traditions and dilemmas that emerge because of the unique circumstances of British history. And by the way, I'm a believer in Henry Kissinger's dictum, and also perhaps Montesquieu's dictum, that nations have characters and that those characters are shaped by historical circumstance. And I think that is very important for today. And then I'm going to take this story in the last part of my remarks right up to the present day and talk about how the UK does and thinks about national security today. But I think history is the clue to that. First of all, what is grand strategy, this term I'm using? Grand strategy simply for me, and there's much contest in this in the academy at the moment, means big picture and long-term thinking. Big picture and long-term thinking. It's not a managerial approach to security. You have grand strategic moments in history when you must think about your first order assumptions and the big picture and the long term. So the core emphasis of grand strategy is to secure the long-term security, peace, and prosperity of a nation or a group of nation, and it belies these modern intellectual distinctions between things like soft and hard power, and also between the material and the spiritual resources of nations or a set of different nations. And crucially, and I will have revealed my hand by now, it stresses the role of history and lessons from history and how to apply historic knowledge. Although I'm going to caveat that at the end with some quotes from the great French thinker, writer, advisor, Regis Debray. Grand strategy, as we understand it, is an English language term which was first used in the late 19th century, but really crystallized in the interwar period, particularly the 1930s, through the thinker and writer Basil Littlehart. And he called grand strategy higher strategy. So it's something about going beyond military strategy to dig deep at the time of planning, mobilization, and the search for resources and preparation for war in the 1930s. He went on to say that grand strategy should both calculate and develop the economic resources and manpower of nations, so if you like, their material resources, but also the moral resources of a nation or a group of nation to foster the people's willing spirit, as is often to possess more concrete forms of power. And that was simply because in the 1930s and the early 1940s, the British experience of world wars was not a pleasant one. Those returning from 1918 felt the promises had been broken to them, and the prospect of fighting a war for empires or for what they saw as corrupt elites was not a particularly popular one. And actually much of the modern British state is born of the Second World War, including things like the National Health Service, which is a wartime measure. Crucially, grand strategy also looked to the peace that came after the war. And what emerges in the context, particularly with Foreign Office planners in conjunction with allies and partners, is a concept of a grand strategy for peace that is designed above all to learn the lessons of the failures of the previous half century. And that emerges after 1945. A grand strategy of peace that's reflected in the United Nations, which of course is a great power piece first and foremost, a grand strategy of peace that's reflected in the building of collective security, because it's the failure of collective security in the 1920s and the 1930s that leads, in the minds of British strategists, to the Second World War. Now, modern definitions of grand strategy are de rigueur again, partly, and this probably dates to about 10 years ago, the publication of Henry Kissinger's book on world order in 2014, which spoke of a crisis of international order in which the foundation stones, the balance of power, was being disrupted by changes to that. And that's seen a revival of interest in grand strategy, a move away from a counterterrorism heavy focus in our national security apparatus, a move away from a management of risk, an appreciation that great power dynamics, great power politics are back in play in a serious way. I think the best book on grand strategy is the one produced by the American scholar Hal Brands, who asks the question, what good is grand strategy? And describes it, I think, in a light touch way that it's most useful for us to say. So grand strategy today, I don't think, should be mistaken as an idea of a perfect alignment of ends, ways, means, resources equals goals equals ends. It is about that big picture thinking. It is about that intellectual architecture. And grand strategic moments come when the fundamental assumptions on which leaders or states have operated and thought about the world get shaken by events. I think we are in a grand strategic moment right now, which calls on the need for grand strategic thinking. And what Brands describes grand strategic thinking as a necessity for a purposeful and coherent set of ideas about what a nation seeks to accomplish in the world. Easier said than done, but not overinterpreted and not overasserted. First of all, and this is not a plea for global Britain or the importance of Britain, I will be humble before you this evening in the manner of Franco-British relations. But this is a plea of why the story of British grand strategy matters, and I'll make a couple of observations why I think it matters. First of all, because the scale of Britain's influence in the world, certainly from the late 19th through to the early portion of the 20th century, is by any reasonable metric significant. That applies both to the expansion of the British Empire, but also to its unraveling and collapse in many places in the world. And you can see trouble spots in areas where I think probably the French and the British uniquely have left some messes around the globe, which are part of our national security challenges today. The role of British grand strategy is therefore vital to understanding European security, concepts like collective security, concepts like the balance of power. It's also vital because it's understood and was shaped by competition with other grand strategies, Napoleonic grand strategy, Wilhelmite grand strategy as well, and that contest I will say a little about in a moment as well. And as I said, it has these global implications and hugely difficult legacies. The next reason why the story of grand strategy is important is it has a really significant role on America's awakening in the 20th century to superpower consciousness. The first set of ideas and precedents used by American grand strategic thinkers come from the British example. Now, there's an important caveat to that, which is the American superpowerdom of the 20th century is built consciously or self-consciously on an anti-British imperial model. It is defining itself as not being the British Empire, from which, of course, American independence was achieved. And yet it adopts many similar habits in terms of actions, behaviors, commercial reach, military projection of force and power thereafter. And if you read Henry Kissinger, if you read George Kennan, if you read the memoirs of anyone from JFK to Roosevelt to Nixon, you will see the British example and the British presidents and the British stories very much infecting the American strategic mind, for good or worse. The two groups of individuals we can see on this slide behind us, one is Uncle Sam, the well-known figure of American power in the 20th century. The other is John Bew, who's the cartoon figure of Britain and Britain abroad, a beer-drinking, roast beef, you might call him, not one for continental manners, robust around the waist, simple speaking, assertive. That's the sort of British self-image of the 19th and 20th century. And it's a relationship that's fascinating in grand strategic terms because it starts with contest, rivalry, and suspicion, and it ends up in an unlikely and not entirely predictable proximity of an Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American world, really, that peaks in this period of the Atlantic Charter in 40 and 41. That story is significant for the American rise to power. Now, I will not take you all the way back to 1485, but I'll offer you 3 or 4 pillars, historic pillars, to understand this British strategic story and Britain's entry in the world. And for the first few centuries, I must confess, it's a story that's projected against the fear of and the admiration and the suspicion of French power in Europe. Spanish power initial, but also French power in Europe. There's an excellent book, one of many, by David Scott, which looks at the emergence of British foreign policy and Britain's projection in Europe over this period. And in it, he says, much indeed like America's projection of power in the 19th and 20th century, there's a schizophrenia to Britain's actions abroad. On the one hand, there is a fear of involvement and entanglement with Europe, Catholic Europe, tyrannical Europe, in the British Protestant mindset. On the other hand, there's a desire to acquire property, to acquire commerce, an assertion of maritime power that brings you into that world. And there's another schizophrenia. There's a fear of, there's what you might call negative impulses, a fear of foreigners, greed, xenophobia, and then there's more of what you might call positive characteristics that come along with this, like a very lively public sphere, a strong tradition of newspapers and challenges to government, and an ethical, what Scott calls a tendency to moral panic about international affairs, like the fate of this minority, that minority, that forces Britain out abroad. All nations are schizophrenic. It's not quite what Montesquieu said, but I think that's what he was getting at in his remarks. Now, again, to zip through that period of time, I would refer to another excellent book by my former doctoral supervisor, Brendan Sims in Cambridge, who talks about the rise and fall of the First British Empire. Crucial thing to understand about British statecraft is that the process of British state formation was a very difficult one, with the Acts of Union between England and Scotland, and then the Acts of Union between England and Ireland, the latter more tumultuous and difficult. So you have a period of state formation, religious and ethnic tension within the British Isles. But Britain, by 1715, after the Anglo-Scottish Union, can be deemed a kind of middle-ranking European power by that period. And then over the course of the 19th century begins to involve itself, not simply by the creation of a blue water strategy, says Brendan Sims, but also, crucially, and you can see why this book was very interesting in the period up to the Brexit referendum of 2016, also by an activist continental policy. And crucially, that is given form by a royal connection with the House of Hanover in Germany, which gives Britain a landing spot, if you like, in European affairs. So the Europeanness and the maritime element are two things that are balanced throughout. And then you have the birth, or if you like, the professionalization of British foreign policy, which comes after the fall of the First British Empire. It comes after the loss of America, which is a huge political shock in British politics, primarily a shock because many of those in British politics and the British Parliament sympathize with the cause and the principles of the American revolutionists. So it leads to an internal angst and soul-searching, seen in Edward Gibbon's book about the rise and fall of the British Empire, says we've got to fix ourselves internally before we're able to look again at our empire and the world outside. And so that leads to the introduction of meritocracy in the army. It leads to parliamentary reform, getting at old corruption. And it leads to the creation of the British Foreign Office in the 1780s and the 1790s. So there's a professionalization of Britain really from this period of time. And zipping through history very fast, lo and behold, comes another grand strategic challenge that crashes on the heads of British policymakers in a way that causes a huge psychological and structural impact in the British state. And that is how to deal with first revolutionary and secondarily Napoleonic France. And the key thing to, at the risk of being reductive or essentializing this process, the key challenge posed by revolutionary France is the concept of wars fought as part of a nation, as opposed to wars fought for simple raison d'etat by dynasties in Europe. So a nation is mobilized through levée en masse, which provides strategic and political and ideological challenges that Britain has not seen before. So you get a further expansion of the British state. Income tax, the most hated tax in British politics, is actually a wartime measure introduced in response to the challenge from revolutionary and Napoleonic France in 1793. The British state increases sixfold in the 1790s to meet this threat. The British Army grows to its biggest size ever in this period of time, its biggest size ever in history thereafter. So the British state is transformed by the challenge from France, and thus begins a cartoon you may recognize of William Pitt the Younger and Napoleon carving up different parts of the world. Britain taking much of the globe of the empire, Napoleon taking Europe thereafter. It takes Britain 6 coalitions to come to terms with Napoleonic France, but it's the only country on each side of the coalition against France over that period of time. So it's a huge period for diplomacy and struggle. And you can see why Napoleonic France is a grand strategic challenge to Britain. All its nightmares coming at once. The fear of invasion, the fear of being cut off from trade, the fear of the House of Hanover being isolated, the fear of the navigation of the River Scheldt being blocked, and there's huge invasion fears in Britain over this period of time as well. So this is a strategic nightmare for Britain in 1812. And thus begins sort of modern British grand strategy from this period of time. And the concept of the balance of power, which had floated around in political theory and political thought, becomes nested in the goal of the government as stated in that period of time. No one power can be allowed to become dominant on the European continent. The Low Countries must survive and be protected. Their independence must be protected by whatever means. The Scheldt River must have freedom of navigation. Britain must be able to trade with Europe. Britain must avoid this fear that a French or an enemy fleet could attack the homeland within 24 or 48 hours from a sheltered port, say, from Copenhagen. Britain actually firebombs Copenhagen in 1806, kills 3,000 people, just for fear that the French fleet may build a fleet from that moment of time as well. And then crucially also, Britain begins to develop these landing spots in the Mediterranean Sea. And the first grand strategic document, I think, in British history, a very rare document, is taken by Lord Castlereagh, the great European British Foreign Secretary, on New Year's Day, 1814, to the continent in the last phases of the Napoleonic Wars, agreed by cabinet, and says you can negotiate anything you want in Europe, but it must answer these principal concerns. There must be no discussion of maritime rights. That is the area where Britain has a strategic advantage from everyone else. So if the victorious powers are to meet, if Napoleon is to be defeated, maritime is off the table. That's Britain's domain. There can be no arbitration, and the Russians are very kindly offering, of Britain's dispute with America. Britain fears arbitration by others. Strong powers fear arbitration by others. France must leave the Low Countries, which were going to be solidified and protected. The French fleet at Antwerp must be destroyed. Colonies can be given back to France, and there's a big noise domestically among producers, among merchants, that Britain hands back over its colonies. France can go back to the 1793 borders, but also, crucially, France must be allowed to rejoin the community of nations immediately. Why? Because the balance of power matters more by 1815 than any ideological fight between Britain and France. And almost immediately, the light bulb switches in the heads of British grand strategists, and they get very concerned that the second fear that comes after 1945 too, is that on the basis of Western Europe being weakened and destroyed, that Russia, Tsarist Russia, will bear over Europe and upset the balance of power again. You have a particularly hyperactive, ideological, in some cases well-meaning Tsar as well in this period of time. And almost immediately, Britain goes so far as to threaten a defensive war against Russia because it's asserting itself over Poland in this period of time. Napoleon, by the way, says of Lord Castlereagh, Britain's realist foreign secretary, "I don't understand how such a great nation could be governed by such a fool," in this period of time. I think more fondly of Castlereagh as his biographer. So British foreign policy after 1815 is to try and do the European foreign policy that it wants to conduct in the course of the 18th century, to keep working within the Congress system, to keep a hyperactive Russian Tsar grouped, it's the phrase that Castlereagh uses, to take the edges off his behavior, to keep him in the tent. But it immediately becomes unpopular because of the moral panic of British politics. Britain is seen as too close to Europe on left and right, actually primarily on left, too close to monarchical Europe, too close to anti-democratic Europe, too willing to do the bidding of emperors and kings with whom Britain shares little in ideological terms in common. So poor old Lord Castlereagh, by 1820, has to sign his own divorce papers from Europe in Britain's State Paper of 1820. And the reason why is because the Congress and the Holy Alliance want to assert monarchical government over stateless principalities that are struggling for freedom. And Britain politically cannot broach that. It cannot use collective intervention to put down democracy, democratic movements, or liberal movements. And so Castlereagh declares that breakaway from Europe in 1820. I wouldn't describe this as sort of original sin or anything otherwise, and I'll be very brief about what happens thereafter. But over the course of the 19th century, from that basis, you have Britain distancing itself from Europe, developing these caricatures, the Russian octopus, the Ottoman Sultan knocked sideways to the floor. I'll keep my caricatures to the east, I suppose, so I don't have to go over to the west. But the distancing from Europe over the 19th century has huge strategic consequence, and also the expansion of the empire that happens. Interestingly, in 1870, a parliamentary committee agrees that Britain should not expand its empire anymore because it's causing a problem that it's growing so far hard and fast, and it's causing an economic problem and a military problem to try and protect it. But the empire grows and grows and grows and grows thereafter, and it grows partly in competition with other European and international empires thereafter. So the grand strategic game kicks in really from the 1870s. And this is the moment, interestingly, when the term grand strategy first emerges. There's a confluence of strategic challenges, many of which I think look very pertinent for today. The collapse or decline of both the Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, so the weakness of other empires, French ambitions in the Suez Canal, of course, which would have a long and checkered history through to the mid part of the 20th century. Above all, the rising power of Germany, which appears more militaristic, but also potentially more modern, efficient, and effective. Imperial rivalries that emerge thereafter when every European country wants its so-called place in the sun. And also international rivalries that go beyond that in the form of America and latterly Japan as well. There's a famous book that which argues the British Empire was created in a fit of absent mind. Now, a very controversial book, one can imagine, the idea that it was created in a fit of absent mind, but it was created without a grand strategy to protect it. And that's what British grand strategists begin to struggle with in the late 19th century. Other powers that grow faster, that are stronger, that are growing iron ships, blood and iron in terms of Bismarck. America are using tariffs, how offensive, versus the British free trading model, that are more authoritarian and militaristic, that are seeking empires, all of which conflated also with the notion of social Darwinism again. And what really transpires, and this is the 20th century story, is that this huge empire, which is at its peak in 1920, becomes a strategic curse as well as a blessing. It gives you great attributes. It gives you great resource. It's crucial to the First and Second World War in terms of manpower and the imperial armies. Absolutely vital, but it is increasingly hard to defend against different challenges and different threats geopolitically. So it's a strategic disaster almost as much as it is a strategic asset thereafter. And into the 20th century then, I'll be very brief, we're half an hour in, so I'm still in good time. You have a different mode of British foreign policy. And I'll come back to this in a moment in my final remarks as well. But an end of splendid isolation, a return to engagement with Europe in those fateful years, in the 14 years before the First World War, and a desire, crucially, to find new allies and partners to reflect and begin to prepare for the coming storm that people can perceive. Two crucial elements of that: the Entente Cordiale, first time in centuries that Britain and France put down their enmities, resolved a number of disputes, but an Entente Cordiale, by the way, that stops at being a diplomatic alliance. It is not a military alliance, crucially, question on that. Also the Anglo-Japanese alliance, the first European-Asian alliance over this period of time, which is a defensive alliance as well. So a period of hyperactive British diplomacy in the first 10 years of the 20th century. And I think that is the most pertinent lesson for us today, but I will come back to it. Again, the grand strategic document, probably the most important of the 20th century, is the famous Eyre-Crowe Memorandum from 1907 that says the Entente Cordiale is not enough. And it's the Eyre-Crowe Memorandum that says the enemy of Britain is going to be Germany, and we are set on a path towards war over this period of time. Hugely influential book, a memo by a relatively low-level official. For those of you who work in government, even if you're a low-level official, sometimes your memos can get a significant pickup. In Neil Ferguson's book, The Pity of War, he says actually some of Eyre-Crowe's ideas lead to this sleepwalk or this slide into war that becomes a huge problem, and there were other ways forward. But in that memorandum, he describes British grand strategy in the most vivid terms. And what he says essentially is because of the diffuse nature of British power, and because it spread everywhere else, and because it is a commercial free trading nation, it is in the strategic interests of Britain to harmonize with the interests of mankind. And that simply means it is in the strategic interest of Britain to stand for those who are seeking to detach themselves or defend themselves from autocracy or the assertion of power. It's kind of an early 20th century version of democratic peace theory for those of you in the academy. But in that, he says, Britain must inevitably be driven to oppose any country threatening this equilibrium. The world works for Britain, and therefore someone challenging it needs to be challenged and not back down. Very redolent of American grand strategy. So zipping through from that period of time, from much of the period after 1918, and this is very much with the case after 1945, you have infused into British foreign policy and grand strategy something even more aspirational. So an empire that is diffuse and weak and challenged, what do we need to do? We need to build a world system or a world order in which it is protected, preserved, and there is an equilibrium restored. That is the mission of British foreign policy, really, from the 1918 onwards thereafter. It's in famous books by H.G. Wells. It has a scientific science fiction component to it. And crucially, it's a project which Britain manages to convince America to get on board with over the course. Not easily, however. The first chance to do this is through the League of Nations, establishing collective security, establishing arbitration between nations, a community of nations to come together to work through international problems. But it only Britain and France ultimately try and fail and make it work over this period of time. A famous quote from the British realist historian E.H. Carr, who says, America is offered the leadership of the world in 1919 and turns it down. But when the international order collapses in the 30s, that focus on ending anarchy and violence through ordering, whether you have a more realist order, a balance of power, or a more idealistic order of free nations coming together, remains in the DNA of British foreign policy. Churchill says in 43, it must be world order or anarchy, and that's picked up by influential figures both pre and post-war, from Roosevelt through to JFK thereafter. What happens in this international order after 1945 is it creates the thing that the pre-1945 international order didn't have. It enforces not only the multilateral system, but it has collective security at its foundation, and collective security with America behind it. That's the difference after 1945. So thereafter, British foreign policy is very easy, for the sake of this lecture, or perhaps not so easy. But it is set in very clear foundations thereafter. It is based not on splendid isolation, but on the tightest possible alliances with the United States and through Europe. There's a renewed emphasis on planning and preemption of threats, and that's seen initially in the Korean War thereafter. There is a very difficult, painful, chaotic move from an empire to a commonwealth, which has a strategic logic to it, but is much less strategic as it plays out. And then there's a shift in the early Cold War to old ideas of balance of power, spheres of influence. The Americans can't quite believe how imperial the British are in the first 2 years of the Cold War. And in fact, a lot of Americans blame British hawkishness over North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, etc. Old imperial habits as being part of this as well. We know that the British Empire is unsustainable. I won't go through that story, but I will hit this keynote, often quoted concept from a quote from Dean Acheson, US Secretary of State, in December 1962, who says that Britain has lost an empire, has not yet found a role. A quote that's wheeled out every 2 or 3 years in British discourse thereafter. But there's a basic grand strategy that goes from Churchill through to Blair and thereafter, which is to have, as Churchill described it, the closest possible relationship with Europe. Easier said than done. One of the most fun historic debates is what would Churchill have thought about the Brexit debate? There's a case he was for, there's a case that he'd be against leaving the European Union. Both advocates, by the way, are fully confident in their position. We will soon be able to find out, because of artificial intelligence, we will be able to speak to Churchill, who will be like an AI hologram, and tell us in a number of years. But that core idea of closeness to Europe, a special relationship with the United States, and in a Commonwealth as well as the sort of three strategic pillars. So Blair described this as the Atlantic Bridge, but countless times over the period of the War on Terror, there was headlines on the front page of the London Times, London's bridge is falling down over this period of time. So very difficult balancing act over this period of time, which takes us, in my remaining last 5 to 10 minutes or so, to British national security today, where I think, hopefully, most of our discussion will focus over. There's one of our 2 aircraft carriers. I believe you guys have an aircraft carrier too, or 2. So the strategic dilemmas in the post-Brexit period are well known and still being worked through, and I've been intimately involved in some of the discussions around those. Does the UK have a certain selfish strategic interest in a certain type of international order? Undoubtedly it does. And what sort of grand strategy would serve this? What are the military and diplomatic establishments that Britain needs to maintain to serve these ends? In 2010, you had, in response to the financial crisis, a period of austerity, and that was reflected in both defence and the size of the diplomatic establishment. There's been a quite significant increase thereafter. Is it time for a new definition of the national interest that Britain is now out of the European Union? Less a security concern, but it does have security implications. It requires, or there's an expectation on Britain to be more active in new markets in places like the Indo-Pacific as well. None of these things are easy. What about this period of 20 years in which humanitarian intervention, particularly in the Middle East, was a major feature of British foreign policy? What does that mean? There's strong echoes of the French debate about this as well. And above all, how does Britain adapt not only to revanchist Russia, but to the rise of new powers, those that look more benign and those that look less benign, for example, with China, India and China, respectively. So in the 2021 National Security Strategy, which I was intimately involved in, we had a sort of 4-part assessment of the context in which we operated. And that was one which chimes, I think, a lot with other partners and allies' assessments of the international situation. So I think one of the things you have seen across the West and its allies, not simply in the West, but in places like the Indo-Pacific, is a convergence of analysis and a convergence of assessment of the threat and challenge. And we identified sort of 4 large trends and shifts which we thought were shaping the international order. The first was geopolitical and geoeconomic shifts by simple metrics of power, a shift increasingly from the Euro-Atlantic area to the Indo-Pacific and other theaters, just in terms of pure metrics of economic and military power, but also oddities within that, within the G20, so the rising importance of countries, for example, like Saudi Arabia, in terms of their heft, reach, military and other investments. Systemic competition, and we use this phrase carefully because we didn't use the US phrase great power competition. And we say systemic competition, we mean competition between systems of government, economic systems, technological systems as well, which has a strong geopolitical component to it, which we could perhaps speak about more. The next challenge is rapid technological change. The UK and France have both done a lot of work, for example, on AI safety, AI regulation. That is the picture, that's the part of the picture that moves most fast I think, for national security makers. And also, crucially, transnational challenges. Now, that is also something in the US national security strategy, the Biden national security strategy, transnational challenges, climate change, migration, transnational crime. Again, then that's linked to the technology as well. Essentially, there's a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. And therefore, the challenge is to have resource between each of them. Now, we've lived in a period in which the geopolitical element of that seems so sharp. I question, or we must question ourselves, whether we retain sufficient focus on the transnational element of it as well. But that's our assessment of the context. And that led to the first of 2 national security strategies, I say, which I've been intimately involved in. The first in March 2021. I think of the context again. This is the month, I think, the end of the TCA negotiations between Britain and the European Union. So not an easy period in terms of being able to define a future relationship for Europe. It led to a big increase in defense spending, the biggest since the end of the Cold War, the merger of our development and diplomatic departments. It's the first attempt to sort of assert a post-Brexit foreign policy. And interestingly, it's in the year of the G7 in Carbis Bay, and it's in the year of the UK hosting of COP22. So it's felt a sort of very active period in British foreign policy. That strategy is based in some respects on sort of standard foundations, core soft power elements, which Britain self-confidently uses these soft power rankings and index. I still think it's very hard to measure soft power as a metric. But we are apparently in whatever source we use, ranked 3rd for soft power. Defense and security, UK's placed within NATO primarily, and then with this expanding defense budget. But again, there's a huge debate in Britain today in all the national newspapers about whether that quantum for defense is enough, and I think that's a debate in France as well. But the 2 new things in the document, or the most important new thing, was for the first time to put science and technology and strategic advantage in science and technology as a core national security aim. And in fact, not only is a core national security aim, it's the first national security aim in the document. And that was quite a big shift, an important signal to those in Whitehall, to those in government about relative priorities, both for defensive reasons, but also for reasons of economic opportunity as well. And out of that, you get a strategic framework based on 4 pillars, which is an attempt to have a grand strategy for Britain in the 2020s. The first goal of British national security strategy is to sustain strategic advantage through science and technology. The second goal of British national security strategy is to shape the international order. And this is a shift from traditionally, after the end of the Cold War, defending risks or threats to the liberal international order, the rules-based order. Now, this is a much more proactive stance to shape that order, particularly where new rules and regulations are being written on things like telecommunications, on things like AI safety, on things like space and cyber. So to shape and have a more shaping role. And shaping is supposed to be a more humble term. Humility is not something that Britain is often accused of in foreign policy. The next fundamental pillar was strengthening security and defense at home and overseas. And again, in black and white, because there's much talk about Britain's Indo-Pacific tilt, in black and white, that document says that NATO and Euro-Atlantic security will remain by far and most the important focus for British national security and defense and investment. That is there in black and white. It's sometimes forgotten about in the debate that happens thereafter. And then finally, this concept of resilience, of which I know there's a lot of interest in France as well. Building resilience at home and overseas is the next foundation stone. So let me zip through a couple of those and bring this to a conclusion. In 2023, we added to this an additional refresh of our national security strategy, which is perhaps a sign of my own failures in 2021, or perhaps more generously, a sign of the fact that the international order had a series of new geopolitical challenges that were causing us grave concern. And there's a lot of political interest. So we have, in 2023, a refresh under a new prime minister, which is more prudent, I guess, and humble in tone, but reflects the fact that the international situation, or the four trends that we identified, are accentuating to cause greater concern or greater risk in our national security. And interestingly, within that, there's an increase in defense budget focused on our nuclear enterprise and focused on stockpiles, because there's a defense industrial problem in Europe, which we may discuss over the course of our discussions. It has a commitment to reach 2.5% GDP on defense, although there was no date fixed on that, which is the subject of live political debate on that. And then we have more China-facing capabilities. There's a turn again to recognize the challenge posed by China, particularly in areas like economic security. I'll end on this slide and two observations. It has been an activist period in British foreign policy since 2019, and I won't go through each of those periods of example. It was often said when I first went into government in 2019, why can't we be more like the French? Activist, assertive on our interests. And actually, if I was to characterize British foreign policy over a period of time, I would suggest we have been a bit like the French on a number of national security challenges. So it's been an activist period. A second thing that's happened, and this really is striking and important for the United Kingdom, is that there is a strong degree of bipartisan political consensus around most of these foreign policy maneuvers and positions. And I can't stress that enough. That changes the nature of a country's grand strategy when it's not deeply politically divided at home over this as well. And perhaps we can talk about the war in Ukraine and some of these issues. But I want to finish with two suggestions based on that historical experience that may help add to this discussion, but also may help guide our collective foreign policy and national security efforts in the years to come. The first is that in these grand strategic moments, we've got to take note of the importance of planning. Liberal, democratic, capitalist economies struggle with planning. They struggle with planning. But the lesson of certainly the interwar years, certainly the period of the middle part of the century, is that planning and finding a way to plan against and in competition with adversaries or those who don't share your values, who plan, is a crucial element of an effective grand strategy. That's quite a hard thing for us to do. I think we are at the bottom of the foothills, but we recognize we must make that journey. I think that reckoning, I was in Paris a couple of weeks ago for President Macron's summit. I think that reckoning is shared and that understanding is shared across Europe. Planning and grand strategy is back, and I think it's important that it's back. We cannot live in an era where we're just managing risk. We are in a competition. The second is a point on alliances and partnerships. One of the things I think that has been a qualitative difference in this period of time is that Britain has not only asserted the importance of alliances and partnerships. Some alliances and partnerships have been difficult, and I will not say anything more than that, but you will recognize that some relationships have been difficult. Some relationships have been white hot in terms of their depth, in terms of their involvement. And what I think is happening in international affairs across Europe is that a shift to a deeper qualitative shift in the depth of alliances and partnerships that involve technology, that involve trade, that involve shared defense industrial development. If you take the Anglo-French relationship, it could involve things like nuclear as well. So there's a qualitative shift in the quality of alliances. So I'll end with a thought that, number one, planning grand strategy, hard as it is for democracies to do, is absolutely vital. And second, if we were to make a very good use of this period, this decade ahead, compare it to 1904 to 1914, there's a version in which we try and scramble for allies and partners against coming challenges and in fear of war and get it wrong. There is a more optimistic version that if we effectively reimagine, rethink the way that we pool resource when we have less share of global resource, the way that we co-create in areas of strategic competition. If we do that effectively, we might be able to celebrate something as we are this year on the 120th anniversary of the Entente Cordiale, a success for statecraft and a success for security, something that avoids some of the more depressing and bleak predictions that we're sliding into war. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you so very much. And I was about to say, I can only commend you on such a comprehensive journey, presenting all the facts in such a clear and didactic way, the positions of the British policy. Is this not coming through? We sometimes get the feeling that we have looped the loop in a way. We're back to square one in a way. Britain, finding itself more isolated, can have dreams of rebuilding, as it did in the 19th and 20th centuries, rebuild the world of the 21st century. Thank you so very much for this, as I said, very didactic lecture. I think all students could certainly appreciate the historic perspective and putting things in such a broad context. But if I may start the exchange that we will have later on with the rest of the audience, a few topical issues. Number one, the Britain and its competitive edge. Britain is looking for competitiveness in a global world. I mean, the project could be the other way around. Pretension to globalism may be less important than the hope for a renewed competitiveness, playing its own cards. I mean, that may be the first question. Maybe it's the two factors may be reversed in the order of the integrated review. For Britain in a globalized world, for Britain, competitiveness meant building its own path, as it were, using diplomatic tools and many other assets to face the future world. Amongst questions, I mean, this was most interesting in the way we can see a grand strategy was shaping up. There's always been this desire, this project to fashion the world, to shape the world. You had the League of Nations, you had the UN, but here in this period which sorely lacks bearings, we can see that international organizations find themselves in trouble. What is the dream of a British grand strategy? Better to regulate the world, to get a better balance of things, to avoid a situation where, as we have today, a tendency to resort to force. That would be question number one. But number two is, after Brexit, assuming everything remained the same, all other things being equal, we can see the path the UK could follow. But the war in Ukraine means complicated integration. I mean, you can see cacophony in Europe, but there is integration all the same. And the way in which it is shaping up, is this being encouraged by the UK, or on the contrary, does the UK see in this kind of upcoming integration, does it see a challenge there, a danger there, the risk of being left out of the European project? And that would be question number 2. And number 3, and because just before you, Professor Kiyama was here, and we discussed nuclear issues, and it's true, in France, there's a big debate about deterrence between the nuclear third age, and recently, again, Putin's latest gesticulations are a case in point. In any case, how does the UK consider the role of its own deterrence force and the role of nuclear weapons to global stability, or could that lead to instability? 3 big questions, maybe answer as you like, but we can see the global strategy and the international order, the European order, and the strategic order.
Well, I have the almost impossible task of trying to answer those questions without making any news. But let me try and take each in turn. So the challenge of globalization and the UK's response to it, the whole question of the UK's relationship to a European project, and then the question on nuclear deterrence. So to take the first, we're dealing with, I think politically, all of us, the same conundrum, really, which is at one level, a reaction against a certain form of globalization that has profound political effects in our own polities and our own democracies. At another level, a version of globalization, which I think it's more accurate to characterize it, which is less soothing than we hoped it would be. I'm not going to say that Fukuyama got it wrong at the end of history, because it's the most boring thing an academic or a policymaker could say. But perhaps let's use Robert Kaplan's idea that there is a claustrophobia about the proximity we have with globalization, and the fact that we are abutting our interests and our peoples are converging, and the planet is hot and overcrowded. So that's the other sort of conundrum when dealing with globalization. But the UK's strategy in 21 and 23 starts again from a simple proposition that and this is to a certain extent a legacy of the imperial grand strategy I discussed, which is it is in the UK's interest to have a free and open trading system. And it's an interest that's, you know, that perspective is perhaps, and this helps me answer your second question, sharpened by the fact that the UK, and I think this is a conversation we would have with the Japanese, the South Koreans, to a certain extent the Canadians as well, all G7 or D10 grouping, if you like, which is outside those large regulatory blocks. It is even more important that free and open trade and economic security exist, and that's a kind of core national interest. So it's about being robust enough to recognize that there are many challenges with globalization, but trying to keep and preserve what is economically beneficial on the other side of this. So it's not a dilemma that's unusual to the UK alone. Secondly, on sort of European security more broadly, I mean, I think it depends what the project is. One would imagine the UK's relationship in security and elsewhere will continue to evolve in Europe. There's a strategic question for the EU as well, which is how does it, over the long term, what sort of relationship does it want with a large, friendly, considerable military power that shares interests, values, and security concerns just to the north of it? So it's a kind of a dual question. That sort of position will continue to evolve. But to take, for example, you know, one proposition, I think the UK would be encouraged and supportive of a journey for Ukraine into the European Union, for example, as well. In fact, Britain historically in the 1990s, I zipped through the Tony Blair era, but British grand strategy was European and NATO expansion for much of the 1990s and 2000s. And then finally on nuclear, I can't give it full justice here, and perhaps we can discuss it over the course of the evening, just to say that there's a live debate in the UK as well, in which we are re-examining concepts of deterrence. We are investing in the nuclear establishment. I think there's a shared recognition, both in France and Britain, that the nuclear is a national endeavor, and some of the skills that are necessary to preserve it have atrophied over a period of time. The fundamental difference, I think, and perhaps where there could be a very interesting strategic conversation, is the UK's deterrent is given to NATO, and it's a NATO deterrent as opposed and distinct from the French deterrent. I think there's much room for fruitful discussion on that portfolio. Absolutely.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, on prend.
Thank you so much. Let's take questions first from students, sir, and the gentleman at the top, and then maybe here. Let's start with Alberic. He's got the microphone, and then you'll get it after that. Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. You talked about the aircraft carrier that you have. We have one also in France. We've got nuclear submarines that we were supposed to sell to Australia, and eventually they preferred to turn towards the United States and the UK as part of the AUKUS alliance. And I wanted to ask you, can European states develop strategic partnerships on a lasting basis with the UK when they know that they'll always be second best behind the Atlantic Alliance? Please, wait. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My question regards the British Army. You have mentioned that there have been several cases of increase of military spending in the United Kingdom, yet the British Army is still plagued by several issues of manpower, of resources, of readiness. Could you comment on that, and what is being done to maybe try to find solutions to these issues? And my second question concerns Britain's so-called tilt to Asia. What is it exactly, and how does it compare to French and American policies in the region? Thank you.
Je prends une troisième question, monsieur là-haut.
Third question for the gentleman there at the top. He raised his hand first, then your answers, and then we can take another round of questions, maybe in blocks of 3.
This insightful but concise presentation. I would like to ask you a question regarding one of the questions that you raised. Is it time for a new definition of British national interest, and matter that is you haven't put on your list of activist periods in UK foreign policy, and that's of the Arctic. And the UK is particularly concerned of the Arctic, notably regarding the Iceland-Greenland UK gap. And so what role for Britain in the Arctic in the long-term future strategy perspective? Thank you very much. And perhaps any advice for France? That's still very niche matter for France, or perhaps any advice for France? Thank you.
Merci. Alors, de l'Indo-Pacifique à la...
Thank you. From the Indo-Pacific to the Arctic via Oceania. So where to start?
The advantage of taking 3 questions at one is I can elide and dodge the controversial ones. I didn't bring up AUKUS, you did, sir. But the question was, can European countries enter into defence industrial partnerships with the UK, given that the Atlantic Alliance will always triumph? I think there's plenty, countless examples of that. And you know, the UK-Polish defence relationship. I mentioned I'm from Belfast, where the Enlaw factory is with a Anglo-French company. So there is plenty on the patchwork quilt of European defence industrial partnerships. There's plenty of projects, and there's many examples thereof. I think there's bigger European defence industry debates over Buy American, the extent to which the European Union, with the encouragement of some member states and the caution of others, wants a sort of defence industrial area or region of its own. I think that's a vastly complicated question and doesn't have a particularly easy answer. If you take, there'll be a German perspective, there'll be a Danish perspective, there'll be a Northern European perspective as well. But the simple answer is not only can there be deeper defence industrial cooperation and project, there has to be over the next period of time. But I don't think that should preclude by American, by British or anything else, but it's vast and it's complicated. And for the UK, I think it's got to work in a way that doesn't undercut NATO, but supports NATO as well. Second question was on sort of British Army manpower readiness, tilt to Asia. Look, it's an extremely live debate that if I say anything here, will get me in trouble. People are looking at it very, very, very carefully. It's in front pages over the course of this week. The Defence Committee's looking at it. I think the Defence Secretary may be saying something, I think, in the next few weeks in Parliament. So I can't, it's not for me to get into that. Just to back and do the and there's, by the way, there are capability decisions with any modernisation project that are really quite difficult, and mercifully people who are far more expert than me, do them. But like in all European nations, there's debates over whether our procurement works. There's debates over, recruitment, as you say, which I think are live but not unique to Britain alone. Just on the sort of Indo-Pacific tilt, and again, I reiterate that the national security strategy is absolutely emphatically clear in black and white that it's the Euro-Atlantic. Not only it's the primary focus, and by the way, there's an Arctic component to that, but also that's where the bulk of the Indo-Pacific. It has been a sort of quite an active period. So there have been FTAs, for example, with Australia. You can debate the economic merits or otherwise thereof. There's been the UK joining CPTPP, which doesn't transform the UK economy, doesn't transform the CPTP, but is not without significance and regarded as so in the region. One of those aircraft carriers the UK sent through a carrier strike group in the Indo-Pacific. It's 2003, I think. There has been AUKUS, I mentioned it, not just others. There's the Global Combat Air Programme, which is with Britain, Italy, and Japan. We had the Hiroshima Accord with Japan, which includes a duty to consult between the UK and Japan, so it's the strongest defence relationship we have with Japan. We've done something recently with an ROK state visit as well, which contains a similar commitment as well. So it's been quite an active period, and what we say in 2023 is we've delivered against most of the metric against that. Is the question we are asked in Indo-Pacific is that on the basis of those commitments, including dialogue, partner status, is our position and our commitment going to be consistent? So that our job is to deliver against that. So it's been an active period, but it's not a sort of lurch. I think it's sometimes misrepresented. So in the latest national security strategy, we say Euro-Atlantic, Indo-Pacific, Gulf, Middle East as the three areas of primary focus, and we're kind of clear about that. And then in the Arctic, it's a great question. We've done a lot with the Joint Expeditionary Force, Northern European countries as well. So the UK is actively involved in the High North. I think there's plenty of people in the UK defence debate that say that the Arctic's becoming more strategically important. But there's also existing treaties and operations that I think that we need to be respected and we need to be careful a bit as well. So the High North, as distinct from the Arctic, as you well know, it's identified in the national security strategy as an area of growing importance. The UK has published a strategy on it. A broader question, as I've said in many areas, can we do more with allies and partners? I think it applies to much of what I said, from land forces to Indo-Pacific to Euro-Atlantic and the Arctic as well. But it's a great question. And by the way, I've been out of teaching for 5 years, so Lou, I'm quite impressed how literate your students are. It worries me for when I have to go back into academia.
Alors, je prends une nouvelle question. Il y a monsieur, et puis
More questions, and then we'll open up the debate to other members of the public over there, and then the gentleman at the top. And I'm not forgetting you, yes. Who'd like to start? Good evening, thank you. I have two questions, very academic. I don't know whether you'll come and teach next year at La Sorbonne to add to your brilliant CV, but anyway, I'll try to make the most of your presence today. What is the method to follow for good historical research? Should you start by identifying the players, the main dates, starting from that to build and contradict? You have a canvas, a system that you use to address that. And then secondly, what is the method to follow to analyze an actor's grand strategy? Do you have a template, a system that you use to approach that? I'm sure that the answer will be very useful to you as a student. Mr. Davidson.
Your enlightening lecture, sir. I had a question regarding Britain's foreign policy post-Brexit, and actually more concerning the consequences of Brexit in the eyes of autocrats, so such as, for instance, Putin or Xi or Erdogan. Has Brexit potentially undermined or weakened European deterrence, which has inevitably led to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? I'm not saying that there's any responsibility, but perhaps in the eyes of an autocrat, seeing a divided Europe could have contributed to its certainty of, or a will to act. Thank you very much.
Merci.
Thank you. There's a question over there. And the next round will be opened up more broadly.
My question is about the differences about the civil versus military point of views of NATO regarding France and Britain. So we see that, for instance, in health and biodefense strategy, there are actually convergences between NATO and the EU, the European Union. But how is Britain involved in this? And because in France, we really skip this point because we try to isolate ourselves from civil initiatives from NATO. So how is Britain involved in the convergences between EU and NATO? Thank you.
Merci.
Okay. Great questions, and I love the historical research questions. I think they're great questions. How do you conduct good historical research? So the very academic answer is to try and approach it with no prejudice and solely with a scientific assessment of the evidence. I think that's inconceivable. So you should approach history. It's fine to approach history through a sense of its value to the contemporary world in material terms. So there's no perfect science of history, but it has to be done with enough rigor and self-criticism and genuine assessment of the evidence to make it a plausible, worthwhile. Because that's the difference between history, academic, and otherwise, which may have a mission and an argument, and polemic. I think that's a very important thing, actually useful for policymakers as well. And in that, I would add, you should be ecumenical in the tools of your analysis and not just project one theory. That's what history, I think, is different than other areas as well. There's plenty of history that goes against that as well. How do you determine an actor's grand strategy? Well, I think one of the lessons of the last few years is you listen to their words and you hear also their grand narrative. You take what they say seriously and you assess it. You don't project it. You don't project your own interpretation of it. You don't not take it seriously. Nations act with a sense of identity, a sense of mission. Sometimes that's based on bad history. Sometimes that's based on historical grievance and narrative that's not particularly pertinent for the world. But you take what they say seriously in the first instance. And because you have a more competitive world, you've got autocrats and others setting out their grand strategies more explicitly. It's been a profusion of periods of national security strategies. They're popping up anywhere. Start with them and work away back from them. I'm not going to get too political on Brexit, but the question was, did Brexit encourage autocrats or invasion of Ukraine? I mean, I think there's no evidence at all for that. If it did, it would probably be assessed as a bit of a miscalculation now, because the UK has been, very active in support of Ukraine, was up to the invasion and thereafter. So it would be a sort of not a great calculation if it was one, but I think there is no evidence for that calculation. And then a great question on NATO, civ-mil divides. I think it's a question for France actually on the sort of on those side of things. I mean, the UK, and this is in full of sort of NATO doctrine, it's the US position, it's everyone's position, wants the best possible synchronicity between the European Union and NATO. But to the other gentleman's question on sort of defence industrial projects, etc., I think that's the big strategic question of the next 5-10 years, to be honest with you, how not particularly the NATO-EU question, but how when you have increasing defense budgets across Europe, more questioning and pressure from the United States, which is, by the way, continuity from Obama, if expressed in a different way, about Europe's ability to defend itself and how it does so. But also sort of core realities, you know, like, I can't remember the exact percentage, but, you know, the large majority of NATO spend, when fully calculated, comes from countries outside the EU, US, UK, Turkey, altogether. Obviously, the US is a significant part of that as well. So but this has been the question of European security in different forms since 1945, and it's reflected in the Marshall Plan, the creation of NATO as well. It's just going through quite a significant evolutionary turn, and it will over the next 5 years. And there'll be within that opportunities for creativity, to the other gentleman's question on defense industrial cooperation. There will be opportunities for prosperity in that period of time, in addition to those challenges. But it's not, there's no easy answer, is the honest answer.
Well, now that students, thanks to your friend, also have had the recipe to write the perfect thesis and probably author books that will be considered as Book of the Year by The Spectator or the Wall Street Journal. But well, I thank you for answering this question. Now we'll broaden questions to non-students. Anyone is welcome to ask a question. So please raise your hand. Mr. Lozotto, gentlemen and gentlemen over there. Let's start with Nico.
Assumption would be that students are meaner than the public of Paris. I'll just leave that with you.
Alors.
Thank you very much. Thank you for drawing attention to the fact that in periods of great trouble, it's better to have a grand strategy than a short view strategy. So there, I fully agree with you. What I didn't find in your lecture, maybe you did that, but you didn't have time to develop. Each time you talked about the grand strategies of the British Empire and then of Britain, you didn't take stock of the outcomes, which were failures and which were successes. For instance, from the French viewpoint, we considered that Churchill's grand strategy was a resounding success, that this man was a visionary genius. We don't see eye to eye on other periods of recent history in the UK, especially in 2016, but you might tell us. And my second question is more precise, but it's true that I would have liked to have maybe a big historical fresco about major grand strategies, but sometimes conclusions, sometimes you're right, sometimes you're wrong, like everyone else. But what do you think were the moments when it didn't work out? And then a more contemporary question. At the beginning of your introduction, you said something saying that the grand strategy needs to look to after the war and look at the peace after the war. So my question is the following. Today, what is Britain's grand strategy for the post-Ukraine war period? Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you for taking such a helicopter view in your conference. As you know, Europeans right now are somewhat worried about a possible Trump re-election scenario and his isolationist tendencies. But you know that scenarios are also drawn if Mr. Trump maybe withdraws from NATO or reduces the US participation. Maybe the Europeans would have to step up in terms of defense capabilities. Given your priority alliance with the US, do you think that such a even partial withdrawal by Mr. Trump will only affect Europe, or could it affect also the UK? Thank you. Sir.
You mentioned at some point during your talk, I think it was just after the loss of America by the British Empire, about having to fight corruption as one of the problems in British history. What do you think of the role of organized crime in the grand strategy? We're looking at failed states, we're looking at corruption, we're looking at huge sums of money which are clearly strategic, moving around the world. How do you feel that plays within, the role of politicians in the forming of grand strategy?
Monsieur John, question très facile.
An easy question, eh?
I tried to give you a fresh go enough, but I take that. It's a great question. So here's two periods of failure in grand strategy, but also bear in mind, among my books, I wrote the biography of Churchill's deputy prime minister, and Churchill went against his generals. Churchill was in big trouble from 40 really to 42, and there was talk of replacing him. And Churchill is unceremoniously thrown out of office by the British electorate in 1945. So nothing is eternal in that regard. And by the way, Attlee, who replaced him, my political hero, says Churchill was a genius on the grand strategic side of things. But look, I mean, the period before the Second World War is the obvious example, and it was, and this is where grand strategists have got to ask ourselves, periods in which those who were responsible for the policy of appeasement did so from the best of motives, from a fear that mobilization could cause such social dislocation and disruption domestically that the cost could outweigh the benefits, that did so crucially on the basis of extensive reading of history. So Chamberlain, for example, would read about Lord Castlereagh and his foreign policy and Canning's foreign policy in the early 19th century. And they would have a debate, and they would say that the Woodrow Wilson peace created without America in 1919 was, compared to the peace of 1815, a disaster. So the 1815 peace, it really is a great power peace. And the criticism of that, of course, is it suppresses liberal democratic movements that then spill out. The peace of 1918 is an attempt to have a different type of peace that reflects self-determination, etc. But by the mid-1930s, that argument is blown up. So I'm not saying that anything other than periods in which people reach for historical analogy, they can get it wrong. This is the Regis Debray quote that I wanted to use, in which he says, 9 out of 10 political errors come by reasoning by analogy. 9 out of 10 political errors come by reasoning by analogy, as in learning lessons from history. So you can be acutely conscious and historically literate and still fail to live to the moment in which you operate. This is why history, to the excellent student's question, is not the only answer to this as well. So appeasement dismantled, but also the period before 1904 to 1914, that 10-year period, which is a very vivid historiographical debate about what happened then thereafter, in which Britain is coming down from its high self-important position of splendid isolation from you and is reaching for partnerships and alliances and doesn't quite get it right. Now, British grand strategy is only one component part of the picture. German grand strategy is another part of the picture. Is there miscalculation? Is there structural differences? But the whole business of alliances and partnerships and trying to assert, the Hague Convention of 1907, trying to arbitrate, trying to stabilize, plenty of good intentions, plenty of historical examples, but it's a failed measure. So statecraft, prudence, wisdom, good judgment in the age in which we operate is the most important thing. But it's a great question. Many failed Cold War strategies. The big debate in the US is that post-Cold War, did Clinton's grand strategy fail? Was it too, boosterish, liberal democratic, assumed the world would work in a way? Did George W. Bush's grand strategy fail, the war on terror? So there's many examples thereof, and I think I'm not such an advocate that I wouldn't acknowledge those criticisms. It's actually the best place to start. The next question was on
peace project after the war.
Oh, peace project, and that is. I mean, let's also simplify what's going on in support of the UK, which is the UK's position, and that is strongly the position of European allies and partners, is to help Ukraine resist aggression and a territorial redrawing of boundaries. Now, I think, and the French debate is fascinating on this, and I think it's a mission that I don't want to put words in President Macron's mouth that he's been pondering and reflecting on. I think that is strategic enough. So one of the things that happened in the early phases was that people rushed to some sort of geographical settlement or version thereof on the basis of history. Remember, there's 2 Henry Kissinger essays, and there was one at the start that talked about Crimea possibly being the thing that Putin wanted, and then one at the end at which Henry Kissinger had moved to Ukraine should be led in NATO. So that, you know, it's a conversion. Look, are we thinking about, you know, whatever outcome there is, you know, ideal, less than ideal, and otherwise? Absolutely, and we're doing it with friends and partners and allies, and that conversation is really quite live with the US, with across Europe as well. But I can't really say here's how we see it thereafter, because there's so much in play right now. So it might be an unsatisfactory answer, but it's an honest answer. Then there's a question there's a serious organized crime question.
No, it's about Trump election.
Oh, Trump. That was the one I was studiously dodging. So let's go. You got me. I mean, look. The UK-US security relationship is deep and structural, and in fact, if Churchill had a core grand strategic legacy, it's that. So it's built on intelligence, it's built on nuclear, it's built on operability of our armed forces in a way that's deep tissue. So it's something that the UK prizes and believes in, and I'm going to avoid trying to making any news on this as well. I think we you know, is there a bigger, broader strategic question for Europe and/or NATO about its own defence? Yes, but you can argue that argument has been made quite vividly, actually, from the time of period of President Obama as well. And if you take the whole course of US history over the course of the 20th century, it is full of concerns being raised about precisely this question. And Henry Kissinger in 2014 describes America as the ambivalent superpower, right? So this is a strategic fact of our lives, certainly, and profoundly the case in the UK is navigating that. But interestingly, when Kissinger says it, it's in the Obama administration that he describes that period of time. So I have avoided saying anything too explicit about it. These are things we must think about strategically, but in a decades-long way. And we do ourselves no service if we think it, you know, just in terms of quick turns of the wheel or sort of immediate political excitability. I imagine that's even less of a satisfactory answer to your excellent question. And then to move on to the serious and organized crime question very quickly. It's exactly right. I mean, so we have in our grand strategy, I had in one of in our national security strategy, I had it in one of the slides, actually a big focus on serious and organized crime. And in fact, the serious and organized crime community, national security community, would say that is one of those principal transnational challenges that are profoundly challenging for the UK. It links to the kind of issue du jour across many European capitals, which you didn't mention, but it's entirely plugged into it, which is migration and the role of criminal gangs in that as well. As you also say, it has tentacles into some of the autocratic states we're operating with as well. So I think it's finally one area where UK-EU cooperation might be fruitfully further developed as well. But you're exactly right. And if you were around the table of UK national security measures, half of them around the table would be nodding very vigorously and saying, perhaps we need to focus on that in addition to these geopolitical challenges, because in terms of things that affect our citizens, things that affect our economy, actually this has a very direct impact.
Alors, on prend d'autres questions, commençons peut-être par...
Further questions, maybe we have questions online. Yes, there's a question online. How is Britain taking on board independentist Scottish ideas when we know the role of Scotland in British nuclear deterrence? Thank you. A question from the audience. Yes, I also had a question about nuclear deterrence. Lately, Britain saw its technical credibility challenged since the failure of the latest Trident missile to reach its goal. And also, there's an issue with the British port. What can Britain do to put its oceanic naval force at the equal rank with Britain or France or the US? Another question from the top of the room.
The war on terror. I was wondering what are the UK's approaches to military interventions nowadays after its experiences and its multiple controversial moments in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Merci beaucoup.
Okay, I'll deal with them as quickly as possible. So, question on Scotland because of support for because its role in the broader nuclear deterrent. I mean, the answer is kind of follow the money. UK defence investment in Scotland is increasing and has over the last couple of years. So, I mean, that sort of that investment is there. I think there's in terms of general polling, there's a downtick, I think, in support for Scottish independence. But you know, this debate will be had long after I leave government. Question on deterrent and the nuclear, the recent test. I can only point you to what the Defence Minister said in the House of Commons on this, it being such a sort of sensitive issue. And then the final question on war on terror and intervention. I mean, I think you can say, I mean, the UK is sort of intimately involved in that response, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and has had a series of public reports and reckonings thereafter, including the Chilcot report. So the creation of the National Security Council in 2010 is part of a kind of structural response to that, which in its attempt was to bring in better coordination between defence, foreign and development. So there's been a series of sort of structural changes and responses thereafter. I think we say in our national security strategy explicitly that the sort of likelihood or the of that type of intervention is diminished in the period going forward, and therefore the capability choices partly reflect that as well. I mean, more broadly, I think the West is going through a kind of strategic reorientation. The criticism in the United States is one that many in Europe recognize as well, which was that partly post 9/11, but we've all, and the UK and France feels this profoundly, suffered from a severe terrorist threat that is metamorphosized over a number of periods of that time as well. And to the gentleman's question on serious and organized crime, which is the right and proper one, and it's got to be said in terms of CT and SOC, those two areas, UK public polling, and I imagine this applies in France as well, still has these areas as very high priority for concerns, and they have the ability to impact citizens in a way that sometimes conflicts over here or there seem quite remote. So we're in this periods in which as the sort of national security thinking or apparatus shifts to grip power competition, geopolitics, regurgitates or revisits questions of defense, it's not like these challenges and threats haven't gone away from serious organized crime to the CT threat. That's the challenge for national security makers. In addition to that, I started by mentioning climate change and migration as two transnational challenges. It's the nexus between all those different types of things, which I think makes it means there is no easy formula to sort of articulate the types of national security challenges we face.
Est-ce que je vais prendre les derniers jeux de questions?
Right, maybe we have time for a final round of questions. Yes, sir. And then I believe there's a question online again, or not? And then, yes, first, sir. Yes, I have a question about industrial cooperation in the defense industry between your country and countries of the EU in general, and more specifically France. Notably, in the past, there were cooperations, some of which were successful. We have been trying here in France to get closer to a number of European partners, in Germany in particular, to see projects through. This is time-consuming. This can be very frustrating. Would it be possible to consider that in this field of the defense industry, France and Britain might be able to resume much deeper relations to arrive at common projects? Well, no, there are existing projects as we speak. Media and Scalp. Mr. Gasquet, yes, well, nobody has mentioned the African continent, but ever since, well, Brexit was supposed to go hand in hand with the new engagement in sub-Saharan Africa, and it looks as though relations between Britain and the African continent have degraded as the shift has moved to Indo-Pacific, the war in the Ukraine, and the lower ODA. But in Africa, well, in the Commonwealth, we have many African countries. So if you put that in a way on the back burner, would not go counter to Britain's greater interest, and that might open the door to other great powers such as China and Russia. And Nicole wants to ask, yes, a final question. You, in your lecture towards the end, you said that maintaining free trade was a fundamental strategic interest for the UK. Now, we find that free trade itself is being challenged not just in China, but also in the US, with a new form of rising protectionism. Whether it's Biden or Trump who gets reelected, there will be this protectionist trend in American trade policy. Now, you said that Britain's national interest would be to shape the international order, or framing the international order. Now, the real issue is that the new rules that would or should apply, especially as regards digital technology, these are dictated by the EU, and you're not in the EU. So how can you reconcile these two things? On the one hand, kind of protectionism that runs against Britain's greater interest, and then new rules and regulations that are made by a body that you have left. How do you respond to these two issues? Well, thank you, Nicole, for these two questions. Yes, you may answer if you wish.
The question on Africa, I think, was an online question, which was post-Brexit. There was supposed to be a great, extensive investment in Africa, which there hasn't been. I mean, I think, first of all, I remember being in government in, I think it was 2019. One of the first things that the Johnson administration did was have the Africa Investment Summit, and we've traveled around, and Commonwealth is another aspect of that as well. Also, and simply, there's, the prosperity element of this is one part of the story, but also there are security related concerns that involve sub-Saharan and Africa and elsewhere. I mean, but the answer is also, in truth, that the rise and prescience and proximity of some of those major geopolitical threats have taken our attention and focus onto those areas. So I was at a book launch in London the other day by an American scholar called Frank Gavin, who's written a book on this as well. He says, if you look at the COVID response or current climate change response of Western governments, they are, in his argument, deeply insufficient to the challenge we face, and yet they are national security challenges. So the truthful answer is that resources are finite and focus necessarily gets oriented into these problems and questions. The discipline that policymakers have got to have is not to allow unexamined or undealt with problems to emerge. There's a massive question, obviously, of a Chinese influence in Africa as well. But there have been attempts to do that, again, against a tight resource environment. So that there was the Carbis Bay G7 initiative. The US has a response to that regarding green finance, if you remember the Build Back Better agenda as well. And then the question on defence industrial, I mean, there are many good examples of UK-French defence industrial cooperation. There are many examples of UK defence industrial cooperation projects plans with European Union states as well. In fact, as I said, I used the phrase white heat. There's quite a lot of energy in some of those proposals and propositions. And then final question on sort of regulations, a great question. So I mean, as I said, the conundrum that the UK faces is one which is being outside of a large regulatory bloc, and it has two very close allies and partners in the EU and the United States, which share values, most security concerns as well. So how it operates around that, I think we're at the start of that story, as opposed to having a sort of fundamental final answer to it. But there's a recognition among states who operate outside those large regulatory blocks, including those in and around the G7, that is a challenge. That in addition to the challenge, there's a challenge over economic security as well. And those are states that will not respond, if you take UK, Japan, ROK, not insignificant states in the global economy, that will not respond through protectionism and autarky. So they have a particular challenge in navigating it. Now, there are areas of regulation, if you take AI safety or et cetera, where actually, you know, the argument would go and follow, and I'm not an expert in these things, that you can actually have a regulatory advantage in some of those areas, notwithstanding the challenges you face. But we're trying to answer these things in different ways through alliances and partnerships. So one of the things we agreed with the United States in last June was a new Atlantic partnership. I can't remember the exact name of it. We have so many declarations and partnerships, so that it's hard to, with in response to actually to the speech of the US National Security Advisor in some ways, who basically was responding to this concern. So the US grand strategists are aware of the criticism that it's not the grand strategy of the 1990s, which was WTO, CPTPP, NAFTA, expansive version of free trade that gave everyone an economic model to row in behind. But politics in the US has changed that reality. And so you have CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act, different elements of that as well. And so Australia is another US ally and partner. So that matters for critical minerals, that matters for regulation, that matters more broadly for things like semiconductor production. I mean, that is kind of major core business, but it's a major core business for the European Union. It's major core business for the US. And you're right, presents a particular type of conundrum, but it's sort of something that the UK actively works on in different places, in different areas. It already has this agreement with the US. But I suspect, like when the gentleman said about defence industrial cooperation patchwork quilt across Europe, that and that regulatory question are noted in the two big strategic questions for EU-US relations, EU-NATO relations, etc. over the decade ahead, and therefore how the UK navigates and responds is kind of going to be an essential element of our national security strategy going forward. I don't have the kind of obvious answer. You're right to highlight the push and pull between the two. That is the conundrum. But the additional conundrum is that globalization is also in the form we all understood and presumed was going to be the direction in recession in that regard. But you don't have the answer. It's the right question.
Peut-être une dernière question.
Maybe there's time for one last question about Ukraine. We have seen under Russian pressure and the challenges for the Ukrainians to hold back. And with the coming spring, we may expect more aggressive military operations. But isn't there a need to arrive at some sort of a summit of European leaders to clarify positions? Well, there was the NATO summit, but that's a long time ago. So there was, at some point, I believe, a project that was shaping up, some sort of a national security. Well, saying the Brits have left, so the European Council is not the way it was during the war of Kosovo. There was a sort of European Council where heads of state said, well, we continue or we stop operations. But now there's no venue where to speak to the Europeans where the British are present. And in fact, in America, because you have the upcoming presidential election, the Congress might block things. Could we not imagine even an informal framework where Europeans, whether part of the EU or not, could converse and discuss these very challenging weeks ahead? Because these are the weeks where we can see that there is upscaling of weapons to Ukraine from Europe and America, but that will take time, and in the meantime things are getting tense. On the British side, could an idea come to fruition?
It's a great question. I was in Paris 2 weeks ago. So President Macron assembled 20 European nations, including the UK, to discuss, some of these issues, less the US, one more, the urgency of support for Ukraine. I think it's fair to say that, there's been a bit of a forum shopping. A good friend of mine, a Paris think tanker, said to me earlier, actually, the more you look at European security, where the investment is going, the kind of shared assessment and community of concern, there's a potential forum which involves Weimar Triangle plus the UK as a sort of four different defense powers. We have made a lot and had a number of leaders meetings with the Joint Expeditionary Force countries, which is the Nordic, Baltic, plus Dutch countries, and that those are 9 of that 10 were the first to send lethal aid to Ukraine. So, but the conversations are happening, I think, but they're not necessarily happening at a kind of packed leader level forum. I mean, the other thing that's happened for the UK is that G7 has become more important actually as a forum, and that's actually the G7 has acted not actually. The record is quite affected over this period of time as well. But you're right. I mean, this goes to my sort of plea at the end for a reimagination of alliances and partnerships, and it goes to the depth of defense industrial cooperation where possible. But you need a sort of qualitative change within that. But you're right that there's no perfect forum. The other one, which I think the UK is hosting next, is the European political community. But again, that's an idea. Again, community of interest, I think, supported probably most by France and the UK initially to find a forum. So President Macron has mused on this, and he talks about the sort of concentric concept. So this is why we're in a grand strategic moment, right? In the sense that, to quote Tony Blair in 2001, if I so may, the kaleidoscope has been shaken. So people are looking for formula operating concepts, etc., and some of that sort of, So there is opportunity in the instability, but you're right. There's no sort of perfect forums. So in Paris 2 weeks ago, it was an ad hoc assembly of people to reflect the urgency of the situation. Guest list was uncertain till the end, but the conversation was good and important. Again, there's a strategic convergence, but there's not always the strategic instruments or levers to pull.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you so very much. It was a real pleasure to have you here.